Two different strategies, two different approaches, and one battlefield, Ukraine. Today, we'll explore how the Biden administration is strengthening an international coalition, sending weapons, and building long-term support to protect Ukraine's sovereignty. But what is Trump proposing? His team promises to end the war in just 100 days, but at what cost? This is the story of how two U.S. presidents, the current and the incoming, envision solving one of the most critical conflicts of our time. Will Ukraine maintain its independence, or will political maneuvers lead to unexpected outcomes? Let's find out. $500 million. That's what freedom costs these days. At least that's the price tag on the latest military aid package for Ukraine announced at an airbase in Germany.
You know what fascinates me about these Ramstein meetings? How they've transformed from simple military coordination into this massive diplomatic powerhouse with 50 countries involved.
Well, that's exactly what makes this moment so crucial. When Secretary Austin talks about Putin's war challenging free people worldwide, he's not just making a political statement, he's highlighting how this conflict has become a stress test for global democracy.
Speaking of stress tests, the timing of this package seems particularly strategic. What's your take on the Pentagon's push for delivery by end of January?
So here's what's really interesting about that timeline. It's like watching a high-stakes game of beat the clock. With Austin's departure coming up and potential leadership changes on the horizon, they're essentially trying to lock in support before any major shifts can happen.
The way President Zelensky put it really struck me, calling it sheer madness to abandon these defense coalitions now.
Right. And when you look at the specifics of this package, you start to see why. We're not just talking about basic military supplies here. The inclusion of cruise missiles for F-16 represents a significant upgrade in Ukraine's defensive capabilities.
That's fascinating because it suggests they're planning for a much longer-term strategic engagement than many might have expected.
You know what's really telling? The way this whole Ramstein format has evolved, it's become this intricate web of international cooperation, but like any complex system, it's potentially vulnerable to disruption.
Well, that brings up an important point about the coalition's stability. How much impact do you think Austin's departure might have?
That's where things get really interesting. Politico's reporting suggests it could deal a significant blow to Kyiv. But here's what I think people are missing. It's not just about Austin's leadership. We're seeing this broader shift in European politics, with some newer governments showing less enthusiasm for continued support.
The geopolitical dynamics at play here are pretty remarkable when you think about it.
Absolutely fascinating. And here's why. We're watching this real-time experiment in international coalition building. When Austin talks about autocrats and imperial ambitions, he's really addressing a fundamental question about the future of global order.
These meetings have essentially become a barometer for Western unity, haven't they?
Precisely. And that's what makes the timing of this $500 million package so critical. It's not just about the military hardware, though the air defense systems and F-16 capabilities are crucial. It's about sending a clear message about long-term commitment.
The pressure to deliver by January must be enormous with all these moving parts.
Well, consider this. We're not just talking about logistics anymore. This has evolved into something much more comprehensive. The integration of air defense systems, the coordination between 50 different countries, the training programs. It's like watching the creation of a new security architecture in real time.
That really put Zelensky's comments about being erased from the map into perspective.
You know what's particularly striking about that? It's how these meetings at Ramstein have become this crucial intersection point where military strategy meets diplomatic reality. The decisions being made there are going to echo far beyond Ukraine's borders.
Looking ahead, what should we be watching for in the coming weeks?
So here's what I'm keeping my eye on. First, whether this aid package actually makes it by the January deadline. Second, how the coalition adapts to Austin's departure. And third, perhaps most importantly, how these newer European governments position themselves in future discussions. These factors could fundamentally reshape the entire support structure we've seen build over the past 2 years.
That really brings home why this particular meeting and aid package are getting so much attention.
And as we wrap up today, it's worth noting that what we're seeing at Ramstein isn't just about military aid. It's about the future of international cooperation and how democracies respond to aggression in the 21st century. While some are sending arms, others are talking peace. Resolving a major international conflict in just 100 days. It sounds impossible, right? Yet that's exactly what Keith Kellogg, Trump's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, is proposing in what might be the most ambitious diplomatic timeline we've ever seen.
You know what fascinates me about this proposal? The sheer audacity of putting such a specific deadline on something this complex.
Well, here's what makes it even more intriguing. They're not just throwing out a timeline. They've actually got a concrete proposal that includes delaying Ukraine's NATO membership for 20 years in exchange for significant military support.
That's quite the trade-off they're suggesting. How exactly do they plan to sell this to both sides?
So get this. They're taking this really interesting dual approach. On one hand, they're promising to protect Ukraine's sovereignty, but on the other, they're offering Putin something he's wanted all along, keeping NATO away from Russia's borders.
That kind of reminds me of the Camp David Accords. You know, finding that sweet spot where both sides feel like they're getting something substantial.
Exactly right. And here's what's particularly fascinating about their strategy. Kellogg specifically called out Biden's refusal to engage with Putin after 2022 as the biggest mistake. They're basically saying that personal diplomacy is the key to unlocking this whole situation.
Though I have to wonder about the practical implications of such rapid negotiations. I mean, we're talking about implementing peacekeeping forces, establishing monitoring mechanisms.
Right. And that's where the skepticism comes in. Even if they somehow reach an agreement within that 100-day window, the actual implementation could take years. We're talking about coordinating multiple European nations, setting up verification systems, establishing new military aid protocols.
The financial aspects alone are staggering when you think about it.
Oh, absolutely. And here's something that hasn't gotten much attention. This proposal would essentially require a complete restructuring of how Western military aid flows into Ukraine. We're talking billions of dollars being redirected through new channels.
Well, that brings up an interesting point about the role of European peacekeepers. How many personnel are we actually talking about?
So while they haven't specified exact numbers, similar peacekeeping operations have typically involved anywhere from 20,000 to 50,000 personnel. And you've got to consider the logistics of maintaining that presence over potentially decades.
The costs must be astronomical.
You know what's really interesting? When you break down the numbers, maintaining a peacekeeping force of that size could cost anywhere from $2 to $4 billion annually. That's actually less than what's currently being spent on military aid.
So, in a way, they're presenting this as potentially more cost-effective than the current approach?
Exactly that. And here's where it gets really clever. They're essentially repackaging current spending levels into a different format that might be more palatable to all parties involved.
Though I imagine the implementation timeline would be far longer than 100 days.
Well, looking at similar peace agreements historically, like the Good Friday Agreement or the Dayton Accords, the actual implementation phase typically takes 18 to 24 months minimum. And those were less complex situations.
The whole proposal really seems to reflect a business-style approach to international relations, doesn't it?
That's exactly what makes this so fascinating. They're treating this like a corporate merger with a hard deadline. But we're talking about fundamental issues of sovereignty and security that have developed over generations.
So what should we be watching for in the coming months?
Well, I think there are 3 key indicators to monitor. First, how other NATO members react to this proposal. Second, whether Ukraine shows any openness to delaying NATO membership. And third, if Putin gives any signals about being willing to engage in this kind of rapid negotiation.
The implications for global diplomacy could be enormous.
And that's really the bottom line here. Whether this ambitious 100-day plan succeeds or fails, it's already challenging our traditional assumptions about what's possible in international diplomacy.